Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision, right? Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, broken.
Right, yeah. It's clean, it's visible, undeniably binary.
Exactly, it's super clear. But when you step out of the hospital and into the world of political theory or sociology and, modern gender dynamics, that x-ray machine just shatters.
Yeah.
We are no longer looking at clean bone fractures. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely subjective, deeply controversial, and incredibly murky.
Oh, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, where, one person's cure is literally another person's poison.
Which brings us to you, our listener. Welcome to today's deep dive. We know you're here because you want to understand the mechanics of these cultural conversations, right? To pull apart these really complex, challenging ideas without feeling completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information out there.
Yeah, it's a lot to sift through.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we are your guides through that noise. So today, we are taking an extensive, incisive, and honestly ultra-long review of a highly controversial 2025 ebook. It is titled Bell Curve Equality: Satanic Marxism, Inverting Differences, Rewarding Parasites, and Punishing Good Behavior by Conrad Riker.
It's quite a title.
Yeah, quite the mouthful. And this deep dive is specifically tailored to explore a text that has very quickly become foundational within the men's rights activist space, the MRA sphere, and the broader red-pilled manosphere. So we're going to provide a really fascinating granular breakdown of Riker's core argument.
Which is a radical reinterpretation of the history of our modern institution.
Right, and how, according to the author, they were deliberately captured by feminists and Marxists long before most people even realized the culture war was happening.
Yeah, it is a complete paradigm shift in how his target audience views the fundamental social contract.
It really is. And hey, if this specific perspective interests you, or if you simply want to analyze the primary source for yourself, you can find the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. You should also definitely follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, to see how he's expanding on these ideas.
Exactly. And please take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these massive, highly detailed reviews. But before we get into the heavy machinery of this book, I need to establish a crucial, unequivocal baseline for this conversation.
Oh, definitely. We need to be very clear here.
Yes. This book contains highly, highly politically charged content. It takes aggressive, unapologetic aim at modern democracy, feminism, the tax code, and basically the entire structure of social welfare. So I want to emphasize, clearly and upfront, that neither of us here at the microphone is taking a side.
Right. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of Conrad Riker, nor are we, attempting to validate or invalidate his specific claims.
Exactly. Our function here is entirely analytical. We're just mapping the architecture of a very specific, meticulously constructed worldview so you can understand the arguments currently shaping this corner of the cultural zeitgeist.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Just reading the blueprints.
Yeah.
So let's start with the foundation of that architecture, which Riker, surprisingly, entirely on mathematics.
Yeah, he doesn't open the book with cultural complaints or philosophical grievances, which you might expect.
Right. He opens with spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And what he terms the stupidity surcharge.
The stupidity surcharge.
Yeah. This whole concept revolves around the idea of an inverted bell curve. To understand where he's coming from, we really need to break down how he is applying statistics to the concept of democracy itself.
So the foundational argument of bell curve equality relies heavily on a statistical reimagining of universal suffrage. The democratic principle of giving every adult citizen one equal vote.
Okay, yeah.
Riker argues that this system fundamentally inverted the natural bell curve of competence. Now, to visualize this for the listener, a standard bell curve, or normal distribution, tracks traits like IQ or economic productivity across a population.
Right, so like a big hill in the middle.
Exactly. The vast majority of people cluster right in the middle, around an average IQ of 100. Then you have the trailing ends, right? The highly gifted, high-producing individuals tapering off on the right side.
Right.
And the lower cognitive, lower-producing individuals tapering off on the left side. Riker's thesis is that in a pure, unweighted democracy, a numerical majority composed largely of what he terms low-net taxpayers can and inevitably will vote to extract resources from that highly productive high IQ minority on the right tail of the curve.
So to bring that abstraction down to earth, he uses a very specific, very grounded anecdote that he refers to as the Matt versus Amber dynamic.
Yeah, this is a really vivid example he uses.
Right. He paints a picture of Matt, a 42-year-old master plumber in Denver. Riker assigns Matt an IQ of under 34, describing him as a guy who can conceptually map and snake a complex municipal sewer line, like faster than most people can tie their shoes.
A highly competent guy.
Extremely. And according to Riker's ledger, in 2023, Matt paid $74,000 in federal tax. He is generating immense tangible value and funding the infrastructure of his city. Then Riker introduces Matt's sister, Amber.
Okay, and what's her situation?
Well, she has an IQ of 91, and she works part-time as a cashier at a big box store. Riker points out that based on the tax code, Amber paid zero federal income tax, but she received $18,700 in various government benefits and subsidies.
Wow, okay, so quite the contrast.
Right. But here is the crux of Riker's frustration. When Election Day rolls around, Amber's single vote perfectly cancels out Matt's single vote.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The argument is that Amber is economically incentivized to logically vote for politicians who promise to keep taxing Matt in order to keep subsidizing her lifestyle.
The mechanism he's describing goes far deeper than just, sibling rivalry. He is outlining what he views as an inherently parasitic system.
Right.
And to validate this mathematically, Riker introduces a correlation coefficient that he claims to have calculated by cross-referencing IRS tax statistics with census voting files across over 3,100 specific U.S. counties.
It's a massive data set.
It is. He plotted the average net lifetime federal tax paid per citizen in a county against the sheer number of ballots cast per 1,000 residents in that exact same county.
And he arrives at a correlation coefficient of negative 0.87.
Which is huge.
Yeah. For anyone who hasn't taken statistics recently, a correlation of 1.0 means two things move up together perfectly. A correlation of negative 1.0 means as one thing goes up, the other goes down perfectly. So a negative 0.87 is an incredibly strong inverse relationship.
It is a massive statistical claim. I mean, what that number suggests, according to Riker, is that the less a specific demographic pays into the system over their lifetime, the more aggressively and consistently they turn out to vote to control the treasury of that system.
Wow. Okay, so they vote more specifically because they need the money.
Exactly. He then layers Pareto's principle on top of this macroeconomic data.
Oh, the 80-20 rule. Right, the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto noticing that 20% of the pea pods in his garden produced 80% of the peas, and then, realizing this distribution applies to almost all economic activity.
Precisely. And Riker takes Pareto's pea pods and applies them directly to the IRS.
Naturally.
He notes that roughly 7% of earners in the United States pay an astonishing 51% of all federal income tax. They are the 20% of the pods carrying the entire weight of the garden.
Right.
Yet, under the rules of universal suffrage, that highly productive 7% receives absolutely no proportional voting weight to protect the wealth they are generating. They are mathematically outnumbered and, in his phrasing, chained by numerical majority.
Which sets the stage for one of the most provocative historical reinterpretations in the early chapters of the book, The Florida 2000 Presidential Election.
Oh, yeah. This part is wild.
The Bush versus Gore recount, the hanging chads, the chaos in Palm Beach County. I mean, most historians view that as a failure of voting machine technology and confusing ballot design. But Riker looks at it entirely through the lens of cognitive disparities.
He drills down into the creation of the infamous Palm Beach County butterfly ballot.
Right, the one that confused everyone.
Exactly. Riker argues that this ballot was designed by a local diversity committee that prioritized empathetic inclusion and large fonts over clear, logical, visual spatial design.
Oh, so he's blaming the layout on a lack of spatial reasoning.
Yes. And as a result of this confusing layout, the ballot was spoiled, meaning punched incorrectly or double punched by roughly 3,000 senior citizens in the county. Riker claims the average IQ of that specific demographic clocked in at 81. Meanwhile, on the exact same day, just a few miles away in Boca Raton, roughly 3,000 engineers and tech workers, averaging an IQ of 118, punched their ballots perfectly clean.
The implication being that the cognitive mistakes of the lower IQ voters effectively erased the intentional correct votes of the higher IQ voters.
That is his exact argument. He asserts that this specific cognitive gap at the ballot box literally flipped the state of Florida by 537 votes.
Because it was that close.
Because it was that close. And by flipping Florida, it flipped the presidency, the composition of the Supreme Court, and consequently, the next 2 decades of global foreign policy and wars in the Middle East.
That's quite a leap.
He frames the entire geopolitical trajectory of the 21st century as a catastrophic failure of a system that treats unequal cognitive inputs as politically equal.
But wait, if society is a massive ship, the author seems to be arguing that only the engineers sweating down in the boiler room should get to steer the vessel, completely ignoring the thousands of passengers up on the deck whose lives are also entirely dependent on where the ship goes.
Right, the passengers have stakes too.
Exactly. Isn't this essentially a modern repackaging of a plutocracy? I mean, historically, plutocracies tied voting power directly to land ownership or inherited wealth. Is Riker just using IQ scores and IRS tax brackets as a modern digitized proxy for that old aristocratic idea that only the wealthy should rule?
Well, Riker anticipates that exact critique in the text, and he would forcefully reject the term plutocracy.
Really? How so?
His philosophical distinction is that plutocracies often protect unearned inherited wealth. He is strictly advocating for an electoral system that rewards demonstrated competence and net positive contribution.
Oh, I see the difference he's trying to make.
Yeah. He points to historical models, specifically Venice from the year 1268 to 1797. In the Venetian Republic, only citizens who actively paid the heavy silk tax were permitted to sit on the Great Council. Riker credits that aggressively weighted, contribution-based system for funding the Renaissance, creating an explosion of wealth, architecture, and art. His argument is that when you defund the non-contributors, civilization doesn't collapse, it actually thrives.
Wow.
To use your ship analogy, he doesn't view the passengers on the deck as vulnerable travelers needing a voice. He views them as free riders who are currently using the ballot box to vote away the rations of the engineers keeping them afloat.
It is a bracing, uncompromising worldview, and it relies entirely on the premise that our current system of unweighted democracy is an aberration from how a healthy society should function. So, if the ship's steering was hijacked by the passengers, when exactly does Riker believe that happened?
When the engineers lose control.
Right. And that brings us to Chapter 3, where his mathematical theories collide violently with historical grievance. He points a massive neon arrow at the year 1920.
19th Amendment.
The ratification of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage in the United States. He literally calls 1920 the year the West married its destroyer.
It is a startling claim, even within the context of the manosphere.
It really is.
But he attempts to ground it not just in theory, but in primary documentary evidence regarding how the suffrage movement was practically marketed to the male politicians who ultimately had to vote it into law.
The 1918 J. Walter Thompson invoice. This part of the book is utterly fascinating from a historical perspective.
It really is a deep cut.
He claims to have purchased an original century-old invoice on eBay, like a piece of paper that still smelled of coal smoke from the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency. And for those who don't know, JWT was one of the foundational, legendary Madison Avenue ad firms. They literally invented modern consumer marketing.
Yeah, and Riker uses this invoice to argue that the suffragists didn't win their battle purely on the strength of moral arguments or civic righteousness. Instead, they hired professional ad men.
They ran a campaign.
Exactly. And these ad men did something incredibly modern. They A/B tested their political slogans aimed at male legislators and male voters.
Right. They tested a straightforward moral appeal. Your mother would vote yes. And then they tested an emotional, coercive, high-stakes appeal. Your wife will divorce you if you vote NO.
And according to the archives and the internal agency memos Riker cites, the threat of divorce, the pure interpersonal emotional extortion, worked 3-to-1 over the civic or moral appeal.
3-to-1.
Riker uses this historical footnote to establish a massive baseline theory for his entire book. The idea that female political power from its very inception is inherently rooted in emotional leverage, social shaming, and the threat of personal disruption, rather than rational, objective civic debate.
But he doesn't just stop at the marketing tactics of 1918. He looks at the immediate, tangible legislative aftermath of the 19th Amendment. What was the very first massive social initiative that passed right after women secured the vote?
Prohibition, the 18th Amendment.
Prohibition.
And here, Riker reframes prohibition entirely. He doesn't view it as a well-intentioned moral crusade against the dangers of alcohol. He views it as the first major wealth transfer and the first mass criminalization of natural male behavior, driven almost entirely by the newly enfranchised female voting bloc.
Right. He describes this incredible, evocative photograph from 1922 showing a speakeasy raid in Detroit. He looks at the people in the photo and notes that 94% of the wrists and handcuffs belong to men.
While the women,
Yeah. Meanwhile, he points out that the very women who had spent the previous 2 years mailing out 400,000 identical Save the Children Vote Dry postcards were now safely employed upstairs in government buildings as typists, punching out the arrest reports for the men downstairs.
it is a vivid tableau that perfectly captures his core thesis. I mean, he argues that prohibition set a permanent, unbreakable precedent for how the state would operate in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Okay, how so?
He quotes an early magazine editor who described the feminine reader as someone who votes based on identifying villains and protecting the vulnerable, almost always children.
Right.
Consequently, this voting bloc consistently votes to outlaw products, behaviors, or spaces that men traditionally enjoy or profit from. But the kicker, the real mechanism of extraction for Riker, is that they then build the productive men for the handcuffs, the police enforcement, and the massive expansion of state bureaucracy required to manage these new, emotionally driven laws.
Feelings first, handcuffs second, invoice third. That is his formula for modern governance.
Exactly. He believes the events of 1920 fundamentally inverted the median voter profile. By doubling the voting pool overnight, it statistically dropped the median IQ of the electorate, increased the median empathy to a fault, and skyrocketed the electorate's willingness to use the coercive power of the state to invoice a highly productive minority to pay for grand, utopian social engineering projects.
But wait, looking at the entire scope of the 20th century, isn't blaming modern economic inflation, the expansion of the tax code, and massive social shifts solely on the 1920s suffrage movement, ignoring a staggering amount of context?
It's a very narrow focus, yeah.
Right. I mean, we had 2 world wars that required total state mobilization. We had the Great Depression, the complete abandonment of the gold standard, the digital revolution, the globalization of supply chains. Isn't pointing at women voting and saying that caused the national debt? A bit like blaming the invention of the umbrella for the existence of rain.
I like that analogy.
Are we really supposed to believe that this single variable changed the fiscal trajectory of the entire Western world?
Well, Riker heavily anticipates this exact pushback, and he attempts to isolate the specific variable of female voting patterns across different eras and different international jurisdictions to prove his point.
Okay, so he looks outside the U.S.
He does. He cites longitudinal data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which tracks data across 38 member countries. He claims this data shows that since 1980, 52% of women consistently vote for higher taxes, expanded safety nets, and larger government, compared to only 31% of men.
Okay.
But his most compelling comparative example is Switzerland.
Oh, because Switzerland famously didn't grant women the right to vote in federal elections until 1971.
Correct. And Riker claims that if you look at the Swiss economic charts, their government spending, welfare programs, and tax burdens spiked almost immediately post-1971, mirroring the exact same patterns seen in the U.S. post-1920.
Wow. Okay, so he's drawing a direct line there, too.
Yes. He argues that the geopolitical events you mentioned, the wars, the Depression, were certainly accelerators, but they weren't the root cause. To use your analogy, the umbrella didn't cause the rain, but the invention of the umbrella fundamentally changed how the state manages the water.
I see.
It forced the men to stand out in the storm, performing the manual labor, while simultaneously being taxed to pay for the massive canopy covering the newly enfranchised voters. He sees 1920 as the moment the extraction software was successfully installed in the mainframe.
Okay, so if the software was installed a century ago, how does the author explain its survival and expansion today? Because a system that just takes money eventually runs out of money, right? Riker argues the state adapted by creating a highly specific, diffuse welfare net. And this brings us to what he calls the welfare womb nexus and the extraction playbook. This is where the book moves from historical theory into a very aggressive, modern-day economic critique.
This section outlines what he terms the 5-step female extraction playbook. He introduces a chilling, deeply biological metaphor here, referring to highly productive, tax-paying men as host organisms.
God, that language is intense. Host organisms?
It's very deliberate.
He is claiming that the entire legal and welfare system is biologically designed to convert male future time and labor into female present consumption. Let's break down the mechanics of how he thinks this actually works. He introduces the concept of the pregnancy passport. What exactly is this tax-free Pentagon he describes?
Well, to build this argument, Riker aggregates the total fiscal value of the modern American social safety net for a single mother. He lists 5 specific overlapping federal programs.
Okay, what are they?
SNFP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps, WIC, which provides grants for women, infants, and children, CHE, the Children's Health Insurance Program, Section 8, which provides heavily subsidized housing vouchers, and the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Okay, I want to highlight the EITC for a second because it's a refundable tax credit.
Right.
That means even if a person's income is so low that their federal tax liability is mathematically zero, the government will still cut them a check. It is direct cash welfare distributed through the tax code.
Exactly. And Riker calculates the compounded value of these programs. He cites a 2021 Congressional Budget Office score calculating that a never-married mother can net approximately $7,310 per year from this specific pentagon of programs, while requiring absolutely zero adjusted gross income.
Zero income.
Right. He then multiplies that annual figure by the 18 years of a child's legal minority, arriving at a taxpayer-subsidized package worth $131,580. He calls this $130K package the pregnancy passport, arguing that the modern welfare state has essentially replaced the historical need for a providing married husband with a diffuse, anonymous network of male taxpayers who are legally forced to fund the child rearing.
He contrasts two very specific, highly polarizing archetypes to drive the visual reality of this home, Latrice and Derek B.
Okay.
Let's look at the mechanics of the Latrice anecdote first.
Okay, so the Latrice anecdote focuses heavily on the distortions in the housing market. Riker details a scenario where Latrice utilizes a Section 8 housing voucher that covers a $1,140 monthly rent for an apartment or townhome.
Which is a huge chunk of living expenses.
Right. Because her largest monthly living expense, her rent, is heavily subsidized by the property taxes of the surrounding homeowners, she suddenly has hundreds of dollars in surplus monthly cash flow.
Okay, and what does she do with it?
According to Riker, she utilizes that newly freed taxpayer-subsidized cash flow to finance a $38,000 Cadillac SUV.
He paints this incredibly frustrating picture for his audience. The hardworking taxpayers are literally floating the roof over her head, which enables her to float a luxury car loan that the taxpayers themselves likely cannot afford.
That's the exact emotional button he's pressing.
And then, on the flip side of this coin of societal irresponsibility, he presents Derek B.
If Latrice represents the extraction of wealth, Derek B. represents the catastrophic cost of the system failing to enforce male accountability at the bottom of the cognitive bell curve.
By the way.
Riker claims to have executed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to obtain an anonymized spreadsheet from a state lab showing that a single man, Derek B., fathered 8 children with 7 different women.
8 kids. And when Derek goes before the judge, he lists his official occupation as rapper. Because he has no verifiable W-2 income, his mandatory child support is set at exactly $0.
But the biological reality remains, right? Those 8 children exist, and the state still has to pay to feed, house, and educate them. Riker calculates that if these children score below 85 on standardized IQ tests, they automatically trigger federal and state special education funding mandates. This costs Medicaid and local school districts an extra $12,700 a year per child.
Per child?
Riker extrapolates this localized disaster across an entire county, claiming that the reckless reproduction of individuals like Derek B. acts as a massive invisible IQ tax levied directly onto responsible higher IQ homeowners through their property taxes.
So in Riker's view, the responsible, high-producing men are getting hit from both sides. I mean, they are paying for Latrice's housing so she can buy a Cadillac, and they are paying for Derek's abandoned children's special education, all while getting zero cultural respect or biological return on their massive financial investment.
That is the core of the grievance.
But where the book gets exceptionally dark is when he analyzes the men who did try to play by the traditional rules. You know, the men who got married, had kids, and then ended up in family court.
Yeah, this is where he leans heavily into SIPP data, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. It's a longitudinal survey by the U.S. Census Bureau that tracks household economics over many months and years, making it a highly robust data set for looking at the long-term, devastating financial outcomes of family court.
And what does he find there?
He cites this data to show that 82% of custodial mothers win primary custody in family court, and an astonishing 91% of all court-ordered alimony flows from men to women.
But the real revelation in this chapter is how he uncovers the bureaucratic mechanisms enforcing these transfers. He details something called the title 4VD double dip. Explain how this works, because this completely reframes the role of the state in a divorce.
This is a vital piece of his argument about the state acting as an intentional extraction machine rather than a neutral arbiter. Under Title 4V of the Social Security Act, States receive federal matching funds as a reward for aggressively collecting child support.
Yeah, so they're incentivized to collect.
Very much so. Riker breaks down a specific Ohio statute to show the perverse incentives at play. He shows that the state spends roughly 66 cents in administrative costs to collect a single dollar of child support arrears from a father.
Right.
But the state doesn't just pass that dollar to the mother. The state bills that original dollar, plus the 66-cent collection cost,
Okay.
plus an additional 10% statutory interest rate, directly back to the indebted father.
Wait, so the state is literally profiting off the friction of a broken family. It transforms the divorced father from a parent into a state-sanctioned ATM, generating revenue to justify the expansion of the family court bureaucracy itself.
Exactly. Riker's philosophical argument here is that Title IV VD creates a financial incentive where the state fundamentally relies on and therefore encourages broken homes to balance its own budgets.
Okay, I have to ask the obvious question that feels like a massive hole in this theory. How does Riker's model account for individual variance?
What do you mean?
What about the millions of women who are not on Section 8? The high IQ female engineers, the female surgeons, the women who are net positive taxpayers and who never touch a dime of alimony? Is the author painting a highly complex, highly nuanced demographic reality with a brush that is just way too broad? Doesn't his entire host organism model collapse if you factor in the massive scale of modern female economic productivity?
It is the most critical pushback to his thesis. And Riker's defense relies entirely on aggregate averages rather than acknowledging individual exceptions.
So he just ignores them.
He concedes briefly that high IQ net-producing women exist, but he argues they are statistically overwhelmed by the overwhelming voting behavior of the median and lower quartile female demographic.
Okay.
To prove this, he points to a specific Congressional Budget Office table. He claims the CBO data shows that over the course of an entire lifetime, the average unmarried woman receives a net fiscal transfer of positive $150,000 from the state.
Meaning she takes out more than she puts in.
Exactly. Conversely, the average unmarried man pays a net negative $260,000 into the state over his lifetime.
Whoa.
Yeah. Riker argues that even if a specific woman is a brilliant neurosurgeon, she belongs to a broader demographic class that, in the aggregate, functions as a massive tax sink. For Riker, the macro-level ledger of the welfare state matters more than the existence of any individual high-achieving woman.
So if this extraction software is running so efficiently, and the legal and economic systems are designed to strip resources from men, why aren't these men revolting? How does society condition them to just accept this burden?
Well, Riker argues the pacification process starts the moment a boy walks into a kindergarten classroom.
He describes this conditioning system as the compliance factory ladder in public schools. It is a systemic, multi-decade process of pathologizing perfectly normal male biological behavior.
He calls it the Ritalin Railroad.
The Ritalin Railroad.
Right. He focuses on what he terms top decile spatial IQ boys. These are the kids who are fundamentally wired to be builders, structural engineers, mechanics. They are high-energy spatial thinkers who need to move their bodies to process information.
But Riker claims they are 5 times more likely to be flagged as disruptive or problematic under modern female-centric school rubrics.
Because the modern classroom is heavily staffed by female teachers and physically designed around female-centric virtues of empathy, quietness, and stillness, it views male physical energy not as raw potential to be harnessed, but as a discipline problem to be eradicated.
Right. Sit still, be quiet, don't move.
Riker argues the education system forces compliance over competence. Rather than adapting the teaching methods to suit the boys, it literally drugs the right tail of the male bell curve with amphetamines to coddle the middle of the classroom.
And he backs this up with an incredible story from New Zealand, the Auckland Teachers Experiment.
Yes, this anecdote perfectly illustrates his point about the nature of boys versus the nature of the system.
Tell me about it.
He details a situation where a group of teachers in Auckland were noticing a catastrophic drop in male literacy and reading for pleasure rates. The boys simply hated the curriculum. So, the teachers covertly smuggled copies of The Dangerous Book for Boys.
Oh, I remember that book.
Yeah, a book filled with instructions on building tree houses, tying knots, and historical battles. They smuggled it into the classroom as a reward for reading.
And the result was immediate. Boy reading for pleasure spiked by 13% in a single term. The implication is clear. Boys aren't broken, and they don't hate reading. The heavily sanitized, emotionally focused material they're being force-fed is simply repulsive to their biological nature.
But instead of changing the reading list, the state changes the boy via medication. And Riker argues this war on male space doesn't stop at the classroom door, it extends directly onto the sports field through the mechanics of Title IX.
Title IX, right, a 1972 federal civil rights law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or education program receiving federal money. I mean, culturally, this is almost universally celebrated as a massive historic win for female athletics. How does Riker possibly spin Title IX into a negative for boys?
He views how Title IX is enforced today as a strict zero-sum transfer mechanism. The law shifted from ensuring equal opportunity to demanding proportional outcomes.
Okay.
Riker cites data claiming that for every 1% rise in female athletic participation mandated by a school, there is a correlating 0.4% drop in the overall male high school graduation rate.
That is a shocking correlation. What is the actual mechanism driving that drop?
His reasoning is that organized sports are the primary, and sometimes only, tether keeping restless, high-energy boys attached to the rigid structure of the educational system.
Oh, I see.
When a school administrator is forced to cut the male wrestling team, the gymnastic squad, or the track team simply to comply with Title IX gender ratio quotas, those boys lose their anchor. You cut the wrestling team, you lose the boy to the streets, or to apathy.
Wow.
He views Title IX as a bureaucratic mandate that ignores natural male interest in sports in the exact same way universal suffrage ignores male IQ.
And then, once these boys somehow survive the educational system, they enter the workforce and the culture at large, which Riker calls the media-industrial estrogen loop. This is where the cultural condition becomes incredibly explicit and heavily enforced. He brings up the FBI's Twitter files.
Right. He moves from education into corporate media and Silicon Valley tech censorship. Riker points to the internal documents released during the Twitter files, specifically highlighting a shadow operation called Media Diversity Action, or MDA.
Okay, what did MDA do?
He claims this specific group flagged over 2,300 independent accounts for promoting what they labeled toxic masculinity.
And 92% of those flagged and silenced accounts belong to men. Meanwhile, exactly 0 accounts were ever flagged or banned for toxic femininity.
He argues this asymmetric censorship creates a massive permission structure for corporate media. Because men cannot complain online without being shadow banned or deleted by tech companies colluding with federal agencies, Hollywood and advertising agencies are free to constantly broadcast what Riker calls castration comedy scripts.
This is dumb dad trope.
Exactly. These are the ubiquitous commercials and sitcoms portraying men as bumbling, incompetent idiots who constantly need to be saved from their own stupidity by their hyper-competent, eye-rolling wives.
But wait, looking at the Norway boardroom quota he mentions earlier in the text, in 2008, Norway passed a law forcing all public companies to have 40% female representation on their boards, which Riker claims resulted in a 12% drop in corporate productivity. If we connect that Norway quota to the boys in school and the tech censorship, isn't he essentially saying we are systematically trimming the roots of a giant wild oak tree to make it fit into a tiny, aesthetically pleasing indoor pot and then acting shocked when the tree stops producing acorns?
That analogy perfectly encapsulates his entire thesis regarding the cultural conditioning of men.
It's stifling them on purpose.
Riker believes society is taking the very traits that historically built Western civilization, aggression, risk-taking, spatial obsession, extreme competitiveness, and labeling them toxic simply because they are inconvenient or frightening to a safety-obsessed female majority electorate.
Right.
Society trims the roots in school, drugs the trunk with Ritalin, censors the branches online, and then the politicians wonder why the national GDP is stagnating, the power grid is failing, and the bridges are rusting.
So we have established the diagnosis. The bell curve is inverted, the welfare state extracts the wealth, and the culture pacifies the hosts. What does Riker actually want his audience to do about it? How do you fight a system that is entrenched?
Well, that brings us to Chapter 16, Rhetorical Warfare.
Okay.
This is where the book fundamentally shifts gears. It stops being a historical and economic critique and becomes a tactical field manual. Riker wants to equip his readers to fight back in daily conversation, to turn the left's shame labels into boomerangs.
He gives them highly specific, almost weaponized conversational tools.
Oh.
Let's start with what he calls the Socratic sting.
Okay.
How does this 30-second trap work?
The Socratic sting is designed to rapidly expose the underlying math of modern morality. Riker advises his reader, when confronted at a party or at work by someone advocating for equity or demanding that the rich pay their fair share, to pause and ask one simple, polite question.
Which is,
Do you believe voting power should scale proportionally with lifetime net tax paid?
it paints them into an immediate psychological corner. Because if the equity advocate says no,
If they say no, Riker says you just smile and reply, then you admit suffrage is simply a shakedown.
oh well.
You force them to verbalize and admit that they believe it is fundamentally moral for people who do not contribute to the Treasury to vote away the wealth of the people who do.
And if they bite the bullet and say yes,
If they say yes, you slap them on the back and say, "Welcome to weighted democracy." Either way, Riker argues, the moral high ground of the parasite is instantly destroyed. You force the hidden math of the extraction system out into the open air.
but he doesn't just rely on verbal debate. He is a massive believer in meme warfare. I mean, he operates on the principle that a sharp screenshot beats a 20-minute sermon every time.
Oh, totally. And he is very strategic about his materials. He heavily utilizes official, undeniable government data to create memes that are impossible for tech platforms to censor without looking blatantly hypocritical.
The CBO tables meme is brilliant in its absolute simplicity.
Yeah.
He takes that congressional budget office table we discussed earlier, the official government data showing unmarried women getting a positive 150K fiscal transfer over their lifetime, and men paying a negative 260K. He just screenshots the table, slaps a big red arrow pointing at the massive $410,000 gap between the two genders, and writes one caption, "Which direction is privilege?"
And he claims that specific graphic completely nuked a massive trending Reddit thread about male privilege.
Really, just shut it down.
Yep. The moderators couldn't refute the official government data, and they couldn't call it misinformation, so they just locked the thread for being divisive. Riker views that kind of censorship not as a defeat, but as absolute verification that his tactics are working.
Then there's the Getty image hack, which is pure, unadulterated psychological warfare using the culture's own assets against it.
Oh, this one is devious. He instructs his readers to go to Getty Images, the massive stock photo site, and search for the phrase strong, independent woman.
Okay.
The very first result is typically a glossy photo of a blonde woman confidently hauling boutique shopping bags. But if you look closely at the uncropped original, there is a faceless man standing just out of focus behind her, physically holding out the credit card to the cashier.
Oh my God, and what do they do with that?
Riker tells his readers to crop the image slightly, highlight the credit card, and add the text, "Independence has a sponsor."
It immediately generates tens of thousands of shares across Twitter and Instagram. And because you legally license the stock photo for $3, there is no copyright risk. You are taking the culture's central narrative of female independence and mocking it, using their own approved corporate imagery.
Exactly.
He even turns watching the Super Bowl into an act of rhetorical defiance with a game he calls Bell Curve Bingo.
Right, you print out a bingo card before the game, and every time a billion-dollar corporate commercial uses buzzwords like equity, lived experience, toxic, or fair share, you mark a square.
Wow.
It transforms multi-million-dollar corporate messaging into a cynical drinking game, completely stripping the advertisements of their power to shame or condition the male viewer.
Okay, I have to push back on the real-world efficacy of this entire chapter. I get that it feels incredibly vindicating to win an argument on a Reddit thread, but what is the actual goal here? Does dropping a congressional budget office spreadsheet into a family WhatsApp group, or springing the Socratic sting on your sister-in-law at a neighborhood barbecue actually change anyone's mind?
Right, that's the big question.
Or does it just guarantee that you will be labeled a lunatic and never invited back to the barbecue next year? Is he actually shifting the culture, or is he just isolating his own disciples?
Well, if we look closely at Riker's underlying philosophy, he doesn't actually care if you get invited back to the barbecue. In fact, he might view getting uninvited as a highly successful filtering mechanism.
Wait, really?
Yeah, his goal is not mass persuasion. His mathematical premise assumes the masses are fundamentally unconvertible because their lifestyles are actively subsidized by the current system. I mean, why would Latrice vote against her Cadillac?
Okay, fair point.
His goal is solely to wake up the 7% of men who are funding the system. He wants to create a jarring, undeniable moment of cognitive dissonance for the high IQ producers. The memes aren't designed to convince the people eating the burgers at the barbecue. They are designed to recruit the one other guy at the barbecue who suddenly realizes he paid for all the meat, bought all the beer, but isn't allowed to choose the music.
That is a crucial distinction. It is a targeted recruitment drive, not a broad persuasion campaign. And what exactly is he recruiting these high IQ men for?
Yeah.
That is the climax of the book, Section 6, the exit strategy, building the parallel polis.
This is the culmination of his 5-year plan. Riker doesn't believe political reform is possible because the demographics are already locked in and the bell curve is permanently inverted. You cannot outvote the people receiving the money.
So what's left?
The only mathematically sound solution is to exit the system entirely.
Exit, voice, loyalty.
Yeah.
He chooses exit. But how do you physically and financially escape a modern, highly digitized, omnipresent tax state? He starts with the protocol he calls financial ghosting.
He provides a highly specific step-by-step roadmap for economic invisibility. He advocates setting up an anonymous Delaware LLC, opening a Mercury digital bank account, and using freelance platforms like TopTal to work strictly as an independent contractor, billing your services at 40% above standard W-2 employee rates.
Why that specific setup? Why avoid being a standard W-2 employee?
Because a W-2 tethers you to the corporate HR structure. It makes you subject to corporate diversity quotas, mandatory sensitivity training, and automatic payroll tax deductions.
Ah, I see.
More importantly, he advises keeping the business revenue artificially small, just enough to live comfortably to completely avoid IRS scrutiny.
How does saying small help?
He cites Treasury data showing that audit odds for single-member proprietorships making under $25,000 have fallen to 0.04%. By staying small, operating cash-heavy, and remaining agile, he claims you can effectively disappear from the radar of the tax farming apparatus. As he writes, the state cannot suffocate what it cannot see.
But the exit isn't just financial. It's deeply, intimately physical. He has a whole regimen for what he calls biological sovereignty.
He argues that the modern physical environment, the microplastics, the processed food, the sedentary office jobs, is chemically and psychologically designed to lower male testosterone and increase docility.
So, to fight this, he prescribes a strict daily protocol, embracing the philosophy of stoicism and the cold plunge.
A cold plunge is key for him.
He advocates going to a farm supply store, buying a $299 galvanized stock tank, filling it with 50-degree water, and forcing yourself to get in for 3 minutes every single morning at 5 a.m. He cites a specific NIH study showing this precise thermal shock creates a 250% sustained dopamine spike in the brain. He literally calls it legal Adderall without the DEA. It is his physical antidote to the Ritalin Railroad we discussed earlier.
And he sets a hard biological floor for his readers, targeting a minimum of 500 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, utilizing hormone replacement therapy if necessary.
Okay, so a strict medical goal.
Yes. He views physical strength, hormonal optimization, and mental resilience as the absolute necessary foundation for political defiance. You cannot resist the overreach of the state if you are biologically pacified and exhausted.
But then he moves into the extreme exit measures. This is where the book crosses the line from lifestyle optimization into radical, permanent secession. He explicitly tells these young, high IQ men to go get a vasectomy.
Yes. He does. I mean, that's huge. He views biological reproduction within the current legal framework of family court as a massive, unacceptable financial liability. He even goes so far as to provide his readers with a Planned Parenthood coupon coined Freedom22 to get a subsidized vasectomy for $50.
That's wild.
His logic is brutal. By permanently removing the possibility of an accidental pregnancy, you completely remove the state's primary mechanism for trapping you in the Title 4BD extraction system. You deny them the host organism.
He also advises putting any physical real estate, like homes, into South Dakota asset protection trusts. Why South Dakota? Because their state laws are notoriously friendly to shielding assets from future liabilities, angry spouses, or civil lawsuits.
And ultimately, he advocates acquiring a second passport.
Just leaving the country.
He looks globally at jurisdictions that still respect his vision of male agency and liberty. He highlights the Czech Republic, noting specifically that after 90 days of legal residency, you can take a 25-question English test and walk out of the police station with a concealed carry permit for a firearm.
Wow, that's incredibly specific.
He aggressively contrasts that level of trust in the citizen with places like California or New York, portraying Eastern Europe or countries like Uruguay as the absolute last geographic refuges for men who want to retain their sovereignty.
Riker warns his readers that there are two distinct paths forward. He mentions the sociological phenomenon in Japan known as shukudanshi, the grass eaters.
Right, a very real trend.
These are millions of young Japanese men who have looked at the economic demands of modern society and simply opted out. They refuse to date, they refuse to marry, and they refuse to climb the corporate ladder because they've decided the juice simply isn't worth the squeeze. They just play video games and work part-time. Riker sees that as a tragic passive defeat. What is his proactive alternative?
His alternative is the Japanese concept of ikigai, a profound reason to get up at 4 a.m. He doesn't want these high IQ men to just lie down in their bedrooms and rot away.
What does he want them doing?
He wants them to actively, aggressively build a parallel economy, what he calls the parallel polis. He wants them building local food networks, trading in Bitcoin, providing services to each other outside the taxable banking system. A decentralized fraternity of high-producing men operating completely outside the blast radius of the collapsing mainstream culture.
Okay, my final pushback, because this battle plan is staggering in its extremity. This is no longer just a political disagreement over marginal tax rates or school curriculums. This is a step-by-step, meticulously detailed guide to peacefully but completely seceding from modern society.
It's an absolute rejection.
It is like realizing the games at the Bellagio are rigged against you, so instead of complaining to the pit boss or writing a letter to the gaming commission, you just walk out the front doors, hike into the Mojave Desert, and try to build your own casino from scratch. Is a parallel polis actually feasible on a macro scale?
Well, Riker would argue it is not only feasible, it is the only mathematically sound option remaining on the board. He points back to his earlier data. The top 5% of cognitive earners fund almost half the entire state apparatus.
Right.
If even a fraction of those specific men, the engineers, the plumbers, the coders, execute his financial ghosting protocol, drop their taxable W-2 income, or move their primary assets to trusts in South Dakota or offshore to Uruguay, the overarching system will experience a catastrophic revenue failure. He believes the desert casino is the only one where you actually get to keep your chips when the night is over.
Let's summarize the massive, exhausting journey we've just taken through this deep dive. We started with Conrad Riker's highly controversial statistical claims that universal suffrage essentially inverted the natural bell curve of competence, allowing a lower IQ, lower producing majority to legally extract wealth from a high IQ, highly productive minority through the federal tax code.
We traced his historical argument back to the J. Walter Thompson ad agency and the 1920 suffrage movement, exploring how he views it not as a triumph of liberation, but as the exact moment emotional coercion and grievance conquered rational economic policy.
We then mapped the specific modern economic machinations he describes: the welfare womb nexus, the $130,000 pregnancy passport, the perverse incentives of family courts under Title IV-V, and the insidious ways in which the education system and corporate media allegedly pathologize normal male biological behavior to force compliance.
And finally, we unpacked his tactical field manual. The rhetorical warfare using Socratic stings and Getty images designed to turn shame labels into boomerangs, and the ultimate 5-year exit strategy aimed at financial ghosting, biological sovereignty, and building a parallel polis completely insulated from the institutions he views as parasitic.
I want to reiterate, as we bring this to a close, that our goal today was entirely analytical and strictly impartial. This text is intensely polarizing and deliberately provocative. Our objective was not to validate Riker's claims, nor was it to invalidate them, but to thoroughly map out the architecture of this specific red-pilled manosphere worldview.
We want you, the listener, to understand the exact arguments, the underlying math, and the deep historical grievances that are shaping this specific, highly influential corner of the broader cultural conversation.
Exactly. We are just here to read the X-rays. And that brings me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. If the ultimate solution proposed by this book is for the most productive high IQ men, the master plumbers, the structural engineers, the innovators to completely withdraw their labor, their taxes, and their participation from mainstream society.
Yeah.
If they all become digital ghosts or expatriates living in the Czech Republic, who exactly is left to maintain the physical and economic infrastructure of the very Western civilization the author claims he wants to save? Is the parallel polis actually a cure for the disease, or is it just a very comfortable, highly optimized hospice for the people watching the ship finally sink?
It is the ultimate fatal paradox of his exit strategy. If the boiler room engineers successfully abandon the ship goes down, and it takes everyone with it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive. We know it was a heavy one, packed with dense statistics and challenging concepts. Please remember to like and subscribe if you appreciated the depth and impartiality of this analysis. It's how we keep the show running. And for those in our target audience who want to dive into the primary source material for themselves, to verify the math or challenge the conclusions, You should absolutely check out Bell Curve Equality on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. You can also follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how these theories are playing out in real-time debates. Until next time, keep questioning the X-rays.